we're totally honored to have Colin Reilly here. Colin Reilly's from New York City. He leads up the GIS team for DO-IT, which stands for the Department of Information Technology and Telecommunications. So he's the Grand Czar of all things GIS in New York City for all the city agencies. So we're so very happy to have him here today. And he's going to talk a little bit today about the relationship that the New York City data has to OpenStreetMap now. And we at the New York Public Library are very strong proponents of open data and open spatial data. Ours is historical, but I'm thrilled to see New York City entering into this sphere. It's really, really an exciting time, and I'm not going to try to take anything away from Colin's talk, and I'll stop talking right now and introduce you to Colin Reilly. Okay. Give him a hand.
Thanks, Matt, for that introduction. And I was going to do this live, and I have to do it through PDF, so excuse me if I'm all thumbs scrolling through this PDF document. So, it's just the basic agenda here. I always like to sort of give an overview of the who, what, when, where, why here, and what I'm sort of talking about today. So that's the basic agenda. So just a bit more about New York City DO-IT and its role within city government. If anybody can hear me, please just sort of raise your hand. Generally, I have a loud enough voice, I don't need the microphone. So, we're effectively the city's IT service agency, right? So our mandate is providing IT services to other city agencies and the public at large, right? So our mandate is not managing buildings, managing the infrastructure of the city, it's really IT services. Within that, my unit sits, and we manage most of the city's enterprise geospatial data sets, I would say most of which are already on the Open Data Portal, and many of which predated their availability prior to the open data legislation. So, and we do a lot of other things. We do application hosting and development, and we provide some services to other city agencies, technical support, things like that. So that's really just the background. For those of you out there, is anybody engaged with the OSM community? Are there any editors here, participants? All right, so show of hands so people won't be new to you. So this is sort of a general overview of what OSM, for those who have no idea what it is. So maybe for those with gray hair in the audience, this is sort of the entry to it. So similar to open source software, this is it's a user-edited, user-sourced geospatial data set, covers the world. Predominantly, from my research, a lot of it is based on the approach where the canvas is empty, and we need to collect data, source it ourselves, and build up the data set. Bulk imports, like what we were engaged in, generally require some interface with the local community, the local editors, build up support, so do some hand-holding, sort of get buy-in from the community, and then go off and do it. And you really need to take special care in not overriding content that's been provided over the years. So there was some sensitivity, and some, we had to approach this sort of delicately with this bulk import of all of the city's data into OSM. And not by all, I mean not every geospatial data set. For this, we limited to the building footprints and the address points. So just a sort of background on, I thought it might be interesting to just give you some sort of the overview of addressing in New York City and sort of set the stage for one of the reasons why we did this engagement. Although there is a single government in the city of New York, there's no central authority for addressing within the city. So it's one of the last remaining functions that the borough presidents handle. And don't quote me on this, but I guess you're filming this, so they don't do a bang-up job quite often, right? So there's a lack of standardization across all the boroughs. There's issues with compliance in the field. You see certain people don't like this number, Feng Shui dictates I should have that number. So, people rip down the signs and they put up whatever they want. That's an issue when a 911 call comes in, or there's a 311 complaint and there's an inspector or a public safety responder and they can't find the address. So, and then there's an ad hoc notice of change to us city agencies managing this geospatial data set. So it can be somewhat challenging. And then you mix in just some of the chaos that exists within the city of New York. Can everybody tell me where this is in the city? So this is Edgewater Park. This is a gated community in the Bronx, and they came up with their own address scheme, right? So they have sort of quadrants, A quadrant, B quadrant, C quadrant, D quadrant. They have names that run throughout the whole complex that repeat themselves, right? So the numbers really don't mean enough. You have to have that character after it. So it's a challenge for public safety. Quite often they're met at the gate. So just keeping this data set up to date is a real challenge, and is really, I like to think of New York City as every exception out there with respect to addressing exists in the city of New York. We probably invented all the exceptions. So you've got odd and even number on the same side of the street. You got numbers that are out of sequence. You know, you've got the concept of vanity addresses. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with that, but there's now a preponderance of those. And in a certain borough, you can pay a certain fee and get that vanity address. You know, you're not on Madison or Park Avenue, but for a simple fee, you can get that Madison or Park Avenue address. Sounds great, but when you're the police department and you have to respond to the fire department, becomes somewhat of a challenge. And the subdivision-specific addressing is one of the examples I showed you, which was Edgewater Park. So I'll ramble through this fairly quickly. I'm happy to take questions as they arise. I can wait to the end. So if you feel like I'm going too fast, raise your hand. If you have a question, raise your hand and ask it, and I'll hope to answer. Did I see a question there? No? Okay. So, and this is just another example of some of the crazy addressing. So you had Penn Station, which is essentially the area around Madison Square Garden. You know, and there's originally 1, 2, 3, and 4. And now everybody likes that Penn Station addressing. So you have 16 Penn Station, which is 3 or 4 blocks away from Penn Station. So, things get a little out of whack, a bit chaotic. So when you're looking at the city's data, look at through the lens of the challenge it is to actually maintain some of this data set. And I have quite a good staff there that manages this data set, and we work collaboratively with the Department of City Planning and managing a lot of the city's geospatial data set. This is one of my favorite examples, and this was in the New York Times. The street name was A New Street, right? So you can imagine sort of the who's on first sort of sequence. They call up 911 or 311, hi, I'm on a new street, right? And there's a white van blocking my car. Excuse me, what's the name of the new street? It's A New Street, right? I know it's a new street, but what's the name of the new street? So you kind of get it. Does this happen only in New York City? I don't know, but in terms of names, that's not one of the best ones, right? Cute, but not very effective. So we have this challenge with managing data. There's no central authority. Notifications are somewhat chaotic. Problematic workflows. This is sort of, I guess, a political correct way of saying that. Our staffing is limited. With the downturn in the economy, we lost some people, so we have less people to edit this data. And then, as I said, there's discrepancies between what the official assigned address and what someone has out in the field. And it just seemed to us we don't have staffing to go out there in the field, verify a lot of this information. So to have another set of eyes seemed like a really good thing. And then, you look around and there's already an engaged community out there. There's the OSM mappers who have vested interest, very engaged, very thoughtful, and diligent community of mappers out there. So I figured, why not try to improve that data set and get some of the information back to help keep the city's repository up to date. And then you've got Local Law 11, which really gives us the legal basis for just freely distributing our data, so there's no longer any restrictions on it, so we can now give it out without having any problems. So, crowdsourcing we attempted in the past. This is CityMap, one of our applications, and we have a data feedback form. It's kind of buried in there. People go and we get, a handful of requests, but it doesn't have the sort of community that the OSM does, right? So it gave us some things, but it didn't really give us the sort of stream of updates that we were hoping to get. So we had tried it. And so, as I said, what was the purpose of this? Why did we engage the community? What was the whole basis for this, right? First and foremost, it's really opening up the data to a wider audience, right? If you look on the left-hand side, that is the open data portal, right? that requires someone to, which is essentially a glorified FTP site, but someone download the data set, remove it from the zip file. You have to have ArcMap or QGIS or some GIS package. You have to have the GIS skills to actually manipulate the data set, right? On the right-hand side is OpenStreetMap, right? It's already there. The data's already baked into tiles, right? So pretty much anyone can use it. So left-hand side, there's a steep learning curve to actually be able to use the open data. On the right-hand side, it's a pretty flat curve. So to me, it opens it up to a much wider audience. And the other thing, as I already indicated, is really engaging a community that exists out there to get some more updates or get more intel on what's happening out there on the streets and the addresses within the city of New York. And this is an interesting one. A coworker up in the state had showed me this. This is a McKinsey report showing the economic impact of open data. And it's estimated to be $3 trillion per year. And a bit insight into the whole city's open data legislation. I mean, everybody thinks it's transparency, but really the sponsor behind open data and the big apps competition is the Economic Development Corporation, right? The data sets are sort of a seed, right? You look at the startup community out there, it's putting the data out there and looking at the, intelligent capital, that exists out there and, using that data to solve intractable problems, building applications that, people want or help solve problems. So that was really the impetus behind open data. And I think it's been highly successful, especially within the city of New York, if you look at the tech sector and how it's built up over the last 5 or 10 years. So specific to the open data, the OSN import and the New York City data, we've been working with Mapbox. When there was Hurricane Irene, we first spun up a hurricane evacuation zone finder application using Mapbox. And I had met Alex Barth along the way. We started talking about things, and he sort of talked about his role within OSM, and I said, it'd be a great thing to sort of release some of this data and bake it into OSM. I think they had just signed up Foursquare at the time, and really they built their business model around OSM and providing viewers and tools to this user updated data set. And so we kind of hatched on the idea of when things were right and the local law was in place and some of the restrictions were out of the way and we could freely release the data, we did that. And so really my role, DoIT's role within this is providing the data and then providing the technical expertise along the way. There's a GitHub site and there's a lot of questions back and forth about some of the crazy addressing and how things are modeled within the city of New York. And so as I said, for this import, what we provided were the building footprints, nearly 1 million buildings within the city of New York, all the perimeter definitions of all the buildings, and the close to 1 million address points representing all the signed addresses, or at least, to the extent we have current and accurate data, all the address points within the city of New York. And they generally represent the approximation of the entrance of the building. And if there are multiple entrances to a building, we'll have multiple addresses to a building, we'll have multiple addresses. So, case in point, the building I used to work at, 59 Maiden Lane, at 66 John, 100 Williams, so we'll have all of those address points associated with that specific building. And all of this data is also available on the Open Data Portal. So if you want to use it for your own purposes, it's there for download as well. And so this was the first kickoff. I actually was running a race, so I couldn't attend this one, but this is, if you see the gentleman standing up there, that's Alex Barth. The woman in the center is one of my old staff, Sarah Haskins. So this was the initial kickoff for the building import. And a bit more history. Initially, the thinking was that Mapbox would handle much of the import, but there was really a lot of interest in the community, and so it really became, more of a OSM community, specifically New York City, working on the import and editing of the New York City data. So, as I said, that was the initial meeting. And the data was broken up by election districts. So these are election district polygons to create unique data sets for the import and bringing them in one at a time, reviewing those. It's sort of committee curated, and then it's published into OSM. There was some initial formatting issues, right? It's going from an Esri shape file into a format for OSM import, and there were some issues with geometry generalization, so and the way data was modeled. So some of those initial issues were resolved, and currently it's 60% complete, with a target completion date probably sort of early spring. And to the benefit of the city, there's a change script that runs that provides us a nightly email notification of all the changes that were made to that data set, right? So during the bulk import, we're getting a mass of notifications, but once the import is 100% complete, and we're generally in sync with the OSM data set, those nightly notifications will give us insight into the OSM mappers making changes to the city data, and hopefully that informs us with changes that need to be made to our data set. And ultimately, moving forward, we'd like to have a bidirectional loop. So as we make changes, there's unique identifiers on these individual features. We can provide the updates back to the OSM community, and they can react to those as they see fit. So this is just one of the viewers. And this is an example of the email that we get. Identifies the change set. It gives a snapshot of what the data edit that was made. You can actually click on the link or the actual map, and it'll take you to the actual location of where that edit was made. So it will be extremely useful for us once the whole import has been completed. This shows you just a detail of one of the updates that were made. Provides sort of basic metadata about that. So we're about 60% through. A lot of the initial discussion has already taken place. So we've sort of have some to-date lessons learned, one of which is metadata can always be improved, right? It's sort of one of those, necessary evils, but really, without good metadata, for one, it's very difficult to work with the data set. For two, for those providing the data set, it just creates continuous stream of questions. What does this mean? What does that mean? So it helped us to build up our metadata. And then in the way some of the data was modeled, right, you have streets that had historical names. So we had references to the current street name and historical street names. And so a lot of the way the data was modeled to accommodate for people who maybe been living on a street for 40 years and they don't acknowledge the fact that one street is now called something different. But for those of us who are more modern, maybe it creates a lot of confusion. So we need to really rethink in terms of maybe how, filtering out some of this noise or additional data set that maybe is no longer relevant. And really, there can't be anything said more about. Just constructive feedback is really important. It's great. Just having a second set of eyes looking at the data and trying to understand it without, obviously you need the metadata, but just looking at it and sort of interrogating it from, just a very objective perspective is a useful thing. I know we use these data sets. They're critical data sets. They're used within the city for, all of the 3-digit numbers, as well as all city agencies using these data sets. So it's important for us to get the updates, but it's also important for us to understand how these data sets are used to inform us for potentially improvements moving forward. And then, there's no way of just understating the fact that New York City addressing really is a challenge, both from a workflow and just sort of a data maintenance perspective. So, future possibilities. There's been talk about some additional data sets being imported. I know they're using Tiger as the street Centerline file for all of the U.S. Our data set is very much in sync with city planning's line file. So, that's a potential additional data set to import in. As I said, bidirectional notifications. We get updates as OSM mappers make changes, and then, potentially when we make edits, we're publishing those out as well. And then also there's been talk of map events focused on specific problem areas. I know post-Sandy, it just really, we've been talking, the GIS, the geospatial community within the city of New York, talking about some of the problems within the city, the Rockaways and crazy addressing within certain areas, Breezy Point, but then when Hurricane Sandy hit, and you've got the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics trying to analyze these data sets, and they're getting these addresses that they can geocode, then the problem becomes much more front and center and relevant. And there's still areas in the city that probably could be improved upon with respect to addressing. So, it'd be interesting to have in the future maybe some map events focused on specific geographic areas within the city with the intention to improve the data sets within those areas. Breezy Point for us historically had been a problem. It started out as this, bungalow community. It's like 4 or 5 tax parcels, right? They're really essentially condos, and for years they wouldn't even provide us the site plans for these. Finally about 5 or so years ago we did, so that area has been improved, but there still are other areas within the city that really could use some improvement. And then potentially this could be a model for other cities and counties or states to go ahead and, have more sort of this, these partnerships where the authoritative data is provided to OSM. And if you'd like more information specific to this project, these links provide, this is access to the proposal that was written to the OS community for this, this import. This is their, this is the meetup, and there's another one scheduled, I think, on the 27th. It's a Google. I can share this presentation so you don't have to take pictures if you like. And then some of the technical details can be found here if you really want to dive into it. If you want to get involved in this project, then by all means. And then any questions, here's my email address, my Twitter handle, or if there's any questions now, certainly happy to answer them.
Can you put the previous slide back, please?
I can. Yes?
Hi, I think it's a fascinating development, very exciting. I just wanted to clarify, were there building footprints in OpenStreetMap, and were they overwritten, or I know you talked about redundancy.
So there were, and most of them were probably, heads up digitizing on screen, right? And so that was part of the, the hand-holding, the care was the emphasis on not, just mass overwriting content that was created over years. But, ultimately accuracy prevails. So yes, there was a smattering of buildings throughout the city, nothing near the volume, maybe, I don't even know what the number was, maybe 20, 30,000 buildings, I'm not quite sure. But yes, ultimately accuracy prevailed, so some of the content was overwritten. So another questions over here?
Yeah. Is this going to be the official city map? Or
No, it's not. It's the official OSM map.
And it's nothing to do with city government?
Nope.
Oh, okay.
No. But, so local law 11 gives us, the authority to release the data with no restrictions attached to it. And, from my perspective, we're managing the city's data. And if someone's accessing OSM, on Foursquare, hey, all the better. They're getting a better view of New York City data. So to me, it's a win-win. It's a good thing. But this is certainly not official.
Where does when changes are made to your building footprint data?
That hasn't been built in yet. So the bidirectional loop doesn't exist yet.
I'm just curious where, when you say on the ground, what does that actually mean?
On the ground meaning what?
When people are going out there and literally seeing changes to the building footprints and that
So we don't have staff out there in the field, so we rely on other city agencies. So there are a couple of specific areas where changes occur, right? So new building construction, demolition, right? That starts at the building department, right? There's a permitting process that gets started there. You have to get a specific permit Those milestones require a new address to get assigned. When that gets assigned, we're then entering that into our system. Could take years before, and it's $50 to get a permit to build a building. A lot of this is speculative development. Maybe 10% actually get constructed. So we look for actual building construction activity, and then we'll enter those in. Also, the Department of Finance, tax parcel mergers and splits can be, or new businesses opening up. So you now got storefront buildings businesses that now want to have their own addresses. So we'll get that information. Certainly, it's far from 100%. Some of the boroughs participate more frequently than others. So that's how we are notified of change. Steve?
You mentioned Lion, and I know that there's been an effort to either update Lion or replace it perhaps with the Street Centerline project.
Well, Lion is based on the citywide Street Centerline. Lion in and of itself is just an export of CSCL, which is the citywide Street Centerline.
So
and it's effectively the whole Centerline data set.
So I was curious what the status is of the Centerline project and how that might relate to this.
Well, the address points come from the Centerline. Lion comes from the Centerline, so those are both publicly available.
Does Lion exist as a shapefile, or is it?
It exists, I mean, that's a city planning export, exists as both a shapefile and a geodatabase.
For agencies who work beyond the boundaries of New York City, right? The problem we've always had is Lion or CSCL, great data set, but it ends at the border. We need to go on past the border to Nassau, Westchester, whatever it is. Do you see the OSM merging with OSM and city agencies using OSM as a
Well, I'm not proposing that city agencies use OSM. They're free to use it, but I mean, right now OSM for New York City is using Tiger, right? If they were to go ahead and import Lion, there'd be a fair bit of edge matching that would need to be done to connect. I mean, not too much, because Tiger does get information from Lion, right? I mean, the naming, I didn't come up with that one. Al probably knows the history of that one, right? But anyway, yeah, I mean, edge matching is always going to be a consideration. For New York State, you can just go to New York State Data Clearinghouse and get Alice for the state, right? Thankfully, to Jersey, we have water, so we don't have to worry about edge matching there. So, it's really just Westchester and Nassau.
What kinds of, well, first of all, does metadata get affixed to these building polygons, and if so, what kinds?
Within OSM, or are you talking just generally the city's data?
Within OSM.
So they took just a subset of what we have. I don't think they took everything. But it has, it has the building identification number, right? That's the key identifier of that building. And a lot of agencies use that for information on permits or violations. So you can use that as a key to join other city data sets to that data set. It now has a height attribute, date last modified, so on and so forth. But, it's really kind of bare bones. It doesn't have all that information. But the bin itself, the building identification number, is the hook to get more rich information from other city repositories specific to a building.
What I'm getting at is, can you pull land use from those buildings?
That's what I'm getting at too.
Oh.
So no. And land use is not building specific. Land use would be more sort of, tax parcel based, right? So, things like Map Pluto will have information on land use, right? Buildings won't. That's not the unit that land use is managed by.
I know you guys have been managing and maintaining the footprints database for a while now, and I know you probably have archived versions of it. Being here at Public Library and having a lot of old maps in New York City, we have a strong interest in injecting all of this historical information for the purposes of study. Would you, as a person from DoIT and from GIS and DoIT, ever be interested in helping folks model the city backwards in time, in effect, to
Sure.
build out the couple dimensions with your data sets, so that
Yeah, well, so for us, day one is when the buildings were first begun to be attributed with the bin. So, like, sort of, I think day one is right, like, post 9/11, right? So 2001. So we've kept a historical record of all building changes from about that point forward. And if you download the data from the Open Data Portal, if you download the geodatabase, there is a history table, and that has every building in it. Some of which may be just spurious geometries that were deleted, most of which are just historical buildings that have been demolished, right? So that's sort of day one for us. If you're looking to go back beyond that, you know, there's aerial photography. You have to do sort of heads-up digitizing on that.
well, and I mean, I understand it's kind of a vexing problem too that OpenStreetMap community is just starting to deal with.
Are they?
With history. Well, there's some folks that are starting to think about that. So it'd be great to get, you know, the input from the people who produce this data and know most about it.
Yeah, we store it. We don't throw it away. It's stored in a history table, and it's part of the data set that's on the Open Data Portal. But as I said, day one starts in around 2001, unfortunately. Yes, Wendy?
By the same token, you don't really want to throw out the baby with the bath. Some of the old addresses should be in the historical file as well, I assume. Do you keep that? Is that the plan?
Yeah, we archive those. There's less sort of interest in those than there is sort of the building representation.
But is it conflict ever with the post office addresses?
Well, we don't interface with the post office. They never reach out to us. It's a mystery how some of these bits of mail get delivered. I think, so no, I have no idea what the post office does. You should ask them.
So in other words, they can't help you with updates or anything?
They don't, you know, they don't give us information. So we're the impetus of change within the city, right? For anything, we should be telling them, right? They're just delivering the the mail. Yes?
If I heard you right, you said that...
I will deny it till the day I die.
Adding the historical dimension of street name changes and that kind of thing.
I was talking buildings.
Okay.
But we do have street names as well, yes. And we just made a recent mistake. Did anybody watch I think Winds picked it up, NY1. It was a very slow news day. So there was a proposal to change the Willis Avenue Bridge to the David Dinkins Bridge, and that proposal got shot down, but someone at city planning didn't read that, and they entered it in, and it sort of got baked into the city map tiles, and then someone saw it and wrote a story about it. So we're since correcting that, but I divert.
My question is, and this has something to do with what the New York Public Library has been doing, which is trying to overlay historical maps on modern maps, using the old street names along with the new street names.
Great.
It's terribly valuable to do that kind of thing for historical research. And so
I applaud them for doing that. We have enough just to keep up with the current world, and we're just keeping things archived, but we're not staffed to try to start, you know, reconstructing the way the city was, you know, previous decades. I think the New York Public Library is doing a great job, and we're certainly willing to support you with data. Not necessarily sweat equity, but yeah. But so we're barely, you know, keeping pace with the current stream of updates, and we're not staffed to really sort of recreating time. Yes.
I agree. Two questions.
Okay.
One was about the difference between vanity street names and like commemorative street names. So are those also $50 a pop? So like.
No, the commemorative names, those are by the city council designates commemorative street names. So those are tended to be the blue plaques under the green. But there's new federal legislation requiring us to change all the street signs by like 2016 or something like that. And they've got specific color, font, size, and the whole 9 yards. So I'm not sure what's going to happen to those blue signs. Those blue signs are a problem. Because the city council just willy-nilly, you know, makes those changes, and we're not alerted to those. The vanity addresses are addresses themselves, right? And those, certain boroughs actually will, for a fee, provide a vanity address.
Okay, and then, yeah, the second question was just asking if you had a personal favorite
That's it.
Can you explain what a vanity address is?
So a vanity address is an address for a street that it is not on. So, you know, you're on East 63rd Street, but you want to sell apartments on Madison Avenue, right? So you buy the address 200 Madison Avenue. In the New York Times, you've got this gleaming glass and steel building that's 200 Madison Avenue. And everybody's like, wow, I want to live on Madison Avenue. If it was East 63rd Street, they might be like, you know. And believe it or not, it's probably worth money in the long run, right? So.
Does it have to be near Madison Avenue? Like,
Oh, you'd have to ask that specific borough president what the qualifications are to get a vanity address. But, you know, from this example, you know, the Penn Plaza one, you know, if you look at 16 Penn Plaza, you know, that's 2 blocks away from. So I don't know if there's a threshold, right? It may be just it's in the borough now. I'm being humorous there, but
10012.
could be, yeah. I don't know. It's a challenge.
Along those lines,
Are they?
I'll be looking for a job on Monday.
you mentioned at the beginning that the borough presidents are not necessarily aligned in terms of the addressing, right? And that's
I said they absolutely are not necessarily.
Has there ever been talk of normalizing addressing across New York, or is that like a hot button, or what's the story with that?
It's probably a political, you know, discussion. So the borough presidents themselves don't report directly to City Hall. So City Hall doesn't have complete control over the borough presidents. So it's somewhat of a challenge. Most of the borough president functions are more ceremonial. That's one of the last remaining, except for some of the ULURP reviews. I mean, that's really the last remaining function they have, the assignment of addresses. And it, you know, can be a problem. Yes?
Could you talk a bit about the background and the licensing requirements to work with OSM? As I understood it, there was a license change because the first was incompatible.
So initially, right, so there was local law 11, right, which basically opened up the city's data sets, right? But in some of our data sets, you know, we're managing them in the Esri domain, right, and managing that metadata, and there's like thousands of tabs to manage this metadata. Someone had left within the metadata copyright restrictions on those data sets. So although local law 11 applied globally, within a few random data sets, someone had forgot to remove some of the licensing restrictions. And so the OS community was like, whoa, you know. So when I was alerted to that, I just made sure everybody removed everything and just said basically, you know, local law 11 applies to this data set. And that, I think that may be what you had heard, and that really sort of solved the problem.
What were the licensing issues before, prior to the law?
Well, I mean, you know, sort of there was, previous administration was a little more close to the vest with, you know, distributing the data, and it required the signing of a license agreement, and, you know, it was a pain in the neck. It's easier just to let it out.
Do you see, are other cities interested or in touch with you about the initiative?
I was contacted by one city, and I'm trying to remember. I think it was Raleigh-Durham area. I don't know. I was considering talking at the, you know, that there's the conference down in D.C. that, you know, the state of the map. You know, I talked to Alex about that, to maybe use this as sort of, you know, some marketing to get other, you know, cities interested. You never know. I mean, you know, to a large degree, it's a herd mentality, right? I mean, look at, you know, the big apps competition, Apps for Democracy, you know. It was first DC, then New York City sort of tried to one-up them, and then it just spread like wildfire. I mean, it could be something similar, you know. I mean, to me, it makes perfect sense, right? But, you know, it's like buying proprietary software. You sort of lock yourself in.
You have that $3 trillion number for...
Yep, that's McKinsey's number.
Is there any way to potentially document that in a way that, let's say, OMB would believe for cities' open data?
I don't think they need to be sold. I mean, it's already on the books. The requirement is to share your data, right? And there's the, you know, there's the I mean, each city agency were required to publish a plan, on how they were going to implement it. Some of the agencies are a bit slower than others, but it's largely an unfunded mandate, right? You got the same city staff that, carrying on their existing functions that now need to sort of free up some of this additional data sets. For us, it was an easy thing, right? Here are shapefiles, just publish them to the Open Data Portal. For other city agencies, maybe it's a bit more of a challenge for them. I don't know. But they don't need to be sold. There's a law. Yes?
One of the agencies that is a little bit slower or closer to that has been the NYPD.
I knew somebody would probably bring that one up. I can't speak for the NYPD because then I'll be looking for a job like at 501. Sorry.
When did the law go into effect?
I think it was, 2 years ago? It's got to be, at least 2 years ago. Because we released a plan. I think we were given 2 years to release those plans, and the plans were just released towards the end of the year. So it's a little over 2 years. Yes?
You have that $3 trillion number up there. Do you ever see in the far, far future the data becoming so valuable that becomes a source of revenue or something like that?
Back to the city? I don't think so. I mean, I think certain agencies have looked at sort of monetizing their data, but as a general practice, the city doesn't believe in that. I mean, that taxpayer money is essentially funding the data set, right. So it would be, I mean, to some degree, it would maybe make sense, if the city's paying for aerial photography and it can get maybe some, private entities to help pay for part of that cost, so it's less of a burden on the taxpayers. That could be potentially, or, you never know.
You see it in the private sector and there's
right.
a lot of data.
Absolutely, yep. And I'm sure the city could, I mean, look at, if it wanted to, transit ridership, people would probably be willing to pay for information like that, but just, as a practical matter, the city doesn't usually do that. You never know. The economy tanks again, and it's looking for how to, I don't know. Yes?
Is anyone else looking at doing crowdsourcing for other parts of the city?
There were some. In particular. That I'm not aware of. I know post-Sandy there was some interest, and I think, the legal perspective, the law department needed to get its, arms around, its mind around, some of the possible legal implications of, people going out there and being in harm's way, and then, it could open up the city to some lawsuits. So I think, and you see this quite often, the thought leadership is certainly not on the legal end of things, and they're sort of like trailing behind, trying to figure things out. So, I think potentially for the next storm there could be, but I think the city needs to first, get its arms around, the legal implications of some of that.
Is there any possibility of the city using the change tracking that you use between OpenStreetMappers and the city data to locate illegal buildings?
Illegal buildings. So that's well, we use the aerial photography, and sometimes we've noticed some illegal construction, and we've alerted the buildings department, and they have all of our data. So, the Office of Data Analytics, they're now, tasked with looking at things like that. Yeah, they could. I mean, looking at, high volume usage of water. There's a lot of ways of looking at, higher occupancy than you would expect, illegal construction. Yeah. OSM specifically, I'm not quite sure, but it's possible, right? You could look at a building, you could check to see, downtown you see all those wedding cake type construction, right? There's a 4-story building that's now a 7-story building. There was a case right adjacent to our headquarters at 75 Park Place where someone had built, 3 additional stories, sold it when the person, and he sold it as a shell. When the person wanted to get the building permit to finish the inside, the buildings department were like, excuse me, what floor are you talking about? Because there's no 7 stories, and so he did it completely illegally. So yeah, it's possible, and we've used the aerial photography to look at things like that, but you have to correlate it with the building permits themselves.
Does the city have satellite data at all? Like
Aerial photography, yes.
Yeah. Is there any plans to? I don't know if OSM has any capacity for that at all.
No, that's probably the last remaining data set that we haven't completely shared, and that's one that's been held up. Yep.
You say it's held up, but you do have relationships with other agencies.
Well, it's shared within the city and it's shared externally by license, but freely distributing, no, we haven't got the okay on that one. Go ahead.
And on what basis of, local law 12 or local law 11 you're talking
You know,
about?
it's a security concern, right? Security is really the only escape clause. You know, the feeling that, city data, some terrorists could use it to do their due diligence to, scout out locations. That's really the basis for it. Yes?
Beyond the work that the local OpenStreetMap community is doing on this project, is the city planning any promotional efforts?
Promotional efforts?
To encourage more people to...
No, we don't do a good job of promoting things. So I'm here, this is about the extent of New York City marketing, right? We don't promote, we don't have some ad company, helping us with our branding. So no, there is no promotional roadshow. This is it. You can get the word out there, Timothy. Yes?
What's the underlying database under this OSM?
It's an OSM proprietary form, not proprietary. It's an open format. If someone's a little more technical on the OSM level, they can. But there is, I forget what the format is.
So at some point, do you intend, I believe the OSM data is going to be the latest data, right?
No.
No?
Not necessarily. I mean, we're still actively. So there's sort of two separate data sets out there. There's the data sets that we're maintaining within the city, and then we've released our data to OSM, and they're going to go ahead and maintain it. They're telling us about changes. We'd like to tell them about changes. So they're sort of, in an ideal world, at 100% same, right?
So, but under that, is this OSM just a viewer? What's the benefit that you're getting by doing this OSM? You already have Google Maps out. You have your own proprietary.
No, we manage our own data sets, right? So, so this is the benefit, right? On the left-hand side, I thought I kind of went over that. You need to have specific expertise to be able to manipulate and use those data sets. And if you're here, you probably, there's a strong probability that you have those skills. For most of the world, they don't know what GIS is. They don't know how to download a shapefile. They don't know what a shapefile is. They don't really care. But if you want to do some mapping, OSM is there. You want to do some basic visualization on Mapbox or CartoDB, your data is already baked into the data set. It's kind of the easy button with mapping.
So is it I can create a small subset data of my interest, I can do things like that? Or
So once it's in OSM, you can then take that OSM, download it, and use it yourself. I mean, the licenses don't exist. I mean, it's an openly distributed data set. So if you wanted to, clip and download a section of it and open up QGIS or ArcMap and start creating your own maps, have at it. You're free to do that.
And you could also harvest the data back to the city, so benefit for you as well.
Yeah, so we get those nightly notifications, right? So an OSM mapper's on their way to work and they notice a new building, address just went up. We weren't notified of it. They put it in the data set. That night we get it, we look, we don't have it. We try to verify that data set. Yep, it's good. We'll enter it in ours.
Do you have an idea of the volume of the queue so far?
No, because right now we're sort of in the import stage. So it's when we're at 100% and they've finished the bulk import, that's when we'll be somewhat at steady state and we'll be seeing just the notification changes.
When you get the nightly changes, then it happens to be a case of, like you said, someone just didn't like their number, popped it off, gave them something else.
We'll ignore it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll try to verify it to the best we can. And I've seen some chatter in the OS community of people adding data and people changing it. So it's, you know, democracy can be a bit messy, you know, but it exists, right?
With a million address points,
Yep.
and, you know, you've been doing this, day one, I guess, was back in 2001. Do you have
Not for the address points, that's much later, but go ahead.
Okay, but do you have an idea how many building and address changes you would expect to see in a given year?
Yeah, I mean, I've done that, you know, and certainly, you know, the Bloomberg administration was, so things change, but, you know, sort of on an average year, you see probably in the order of 500 new buildings a year. 600, you know, towards the end of the Bloomberg administration, we're probably seeing a bit more, you know, but that's generally what you see. You know, but you'll see a lot more addresses, you know, because you'll have, you know, infill changes. So, but that's, you know, generally what I've seen. It's a built city. It's somewhat a magical number, but we're also working on cleaning things up. So when it was the data set was originally created, it wasn't perfect. So a lot of what's done is as you're going and you're adding something new, you're cleaning up around it because it wasn't perfect as a starting point. Yes?
When you say 500 to 600 new buildings, is that just Manhattan or the whole of New York City?
That's all of New York City.
All 5 more?
Correct.
Okay.
That was the last time I checked, and so it could be higher. Don't quote me on that, but that's sort of an approximate. Yes?
Aside from just the nightly changes or the updates, aside from just the addresses, do you ever see the long-term, real-time kind of data changes in terms of like things like Sandy emergencies where?
Yeah, it'd be great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not immediately, obviously. But.
Yeah, I think, you know, some of the, you know, systems, some of the agencies, their systems within the city would need to, you know, change considerably. You know, like at the Department of Buildings, they manage things from a permit perspective, less from a construction milestone perspective. You know, so, you know, it'd be useful to have those construction milestones, right? Like the foundation's been poured, superstructure's up, you know, because then you could more easily react to changes. They're just managing, you know, plumbing permits, electrical permits, so more from a, you know, regulatory perspective, and so it becomes a little more challenging. I could see it, but it would require some, you know, pretty considerable changes, some existing systems within the city. Yes.
So, as per local law 11, you release these databases, you maintain the data mine, and you're encouraging a relationship with the OSM community. Under a contract?
No, there's no contract.
There's no contract. You're just facilitating the transfer.
OSM is it's a foundation, right? So it was just, yeah, we worked. There's no legal connection between us. We just, through local law 11, you know, the data is freely distributed and available to all. And it was really more of just an engagement and working with them to help with the import. There's no contract, there's no money involved. Yes?
Is the import run itself, and is there a plan for its sort of continued existence beyond the scope of this initial kind of bulk import?
No, so the import would be until it's 100% all of the, you know, data sets.
The sync, the sort of change set.
Well, that's kind of the next step once everything's in, and, you know, talk to Alex about it. Okay, so they have all the unique IDs, so now it's building that sort of same notification stream saying, okay, so you're telling us what you've done, now we can tell you what we've done, and, you know, so that's certainly, you know, technically feasible within the realm of possibility.
Has there always been tasked with doing these updates, or were there other agencies that used to do it, and then what do you?
Which updates?
The addresses.
So that's, well, it's, a lot of the data sets are managed, probably the two big agencies are Do It and City Planning. So, you know, 90% of your enterprise geospatial data sets are managed by those two entities, right? And you've got,
you sync with stuff all the time?
yeah, for the most part. It's not, you know, It's not 100% perfect, you know, the bin assignment is, you know, but yeah, we meet regularly. You know, the data set specific to CSCL and the address points, it's one enterprise geospatial database. And city planning is just one of the editors. And there's validation rules within that. So we manage that collectively. And the buildings as well. So all of those data sets are very tightly integrated and synchronized. Yes?
Is there any data set that you're aware of that, like, over and above just the building numbers, has information on, like, business names and things like that? Is there an agency that collects?
The business name, so no, so that's more of a state function, right? So the licensing of businesses happens at the state for most, I think for most businesses, right? So no, that's not really a city function. So we're not managing business names, no. Yes?
What kind of updates do you expect to gather from OSM? Like all the building numbers and all, I'm sure like there's some central body that, you know, allows, so there's not going to be any change in that respect. So what kind of updates do you expect?
Well, I mean, it's continually evolving city, plus, as I said, it's not 100% perfect, right? So there's still areas of the city that need, you know, validation, correction, and you know, infill data set. So there's, you know, getting it to 100%, and then as things change, since we're not completely notified of all those changes, it's just another set of eyes out there to know, to alert of us things that might have changed.
I mean, if some, like, assume that there's a new building that's come up, or a building that's been split up into two, so you have two different addresses, and those information you would be getting from other departments.
For the most part, yes, we would get those from, you know, if they've gone through the, you know, permitting process, we would be notified of those. Could be illegal construction, you know, sometimes state and federal entities don't go through the buildings permitting process, so that, you know, federal buildings, they just pop up wherever. So, you know, for the most part, yes, 100% no.
But I guess if somebody's doing something illegal, they're not going to go to OSM and update the address, right? To get
Well, if they're doing something illegal, we might not know about it, but they're still doing it. And if you're walking across the street and you happen to see something, you're just notifying the city that, hey, this new address exists. We might see it and say, hey, we didn't know that exists. Can you go look out there? And they find out that they didn't have a permit to construct whatever they're constructing. That's a way of finding illegal construction. You know, that's not the intention of this. We're not looking to find illegal construction by that. You know, that's not our mandate. That could be a derivative of some of the work. You never know.
So what's the target audience for this? Who are going to be
You people.
That's what am I going to do? Like, see, I'm GIS.
You can do with it whatever you like. Are you a mapper?
I am GIS developer for the last 15 years.
Okay.
But I've been working on geomedia.
Okay.
So I'm a little bit aware of XML. Like, I've worked on OBC standards. So that's my other question.
Alright.
How does OSM stand with respect to OBC standards? Like,
Well, I mean, you know, it depends on what geomedia you can do. I know very little about geomedia, right? But if there's a web client and you can connect to like a slippery tile set, you can then, you know, you can then connect it to, can you connect to Google Maps? MapQuest? Are we talking like a thick client or a thin client?
geomedia has both.
Okay.
It's built on OBC standards. Like,
So there you go. Answer solved. Yes, you can connect to OSM.
so, no, but my question is like, what I'm debating in my mind is like, what's the advantage that you're getting by, like you have your proprietary.
We're putting it out there for everyone to use. It's just another option for us. You know, you could go into the finer debate of whether what it means to you, but to me, it's just another way of accessing the city's data. It's just a bit easier to do because the tile sets are already created for you. And so then it's up to you. You could choose to use it. You could choose to use, you know, Google, Bing, MapQuest.
Google Maps has not open data.
Right.
I can't go into Google Maps and download their data and use it. I can't do this. That's the main thing.
And this is also the only, like I think it's the only free global data set and the quality varies from area to area. The cool thing about New York is that it's really, really good in New York all of a sudden, because it's improving everywhere. But you know, if you use Foursquare, that data is better. If you use any number of apps that uses this, you'll see a benefit.
So is this based on OGC standards? Does it follow some OGC standards? Or?
Sure.
OGC is a bit, behind the times. They take like 5 years to publish their standards, so they're sort of back with the attorneys.
How big is the import project? I mean, you had a picture of like 3 people with laptops.
So I only know most of the people virtually, so I think it's like, at the initial kickoff they had 14 people, and there's like probably about 10. Is anybody engaged in the whole New York City import? Okay, so there's a lot of chat.
Was there a first session?
Okay.
Not as exciting as you made it sound.
I didn't try to make it sound.
Like, what's this shape? What is it? It's still building here. So it was like a
well, I did say democracy's messy,
yeah.
and it's an example of messy democracy. But hey, Yes. Yep.
Oh, this is a hardball question.
Okay.
You choose not to answer it, I understand. I started working with the Department of Finance in 1982 as part of a unit that computerized the property assessment valuation process. We collected data, collected quality data, after that, I started influencing that. And we found other ways to go into the same process, changing the way we do things. Computerized. What we also found is that there was a tremendous trade-off between data collection and technological change. And that the money was going to technology, not into data collection. So the data sets were declining in value. I don't know, has that ever, I've been retired for 8 years. 8 years ago, I knew it was still true. Has there been a renewed effort to get better data and verification?
I mean, I can speak only for our agency, and since we manage, the geospatial repository. With respect to our data, now it's all about, accuracy and currency. I can't speak to the finance department in terms of, doing their assessments and, valuations. We did lose a couple of staff, when the economy went down. So, it's the age-old do more with less sort of thing. So to say that, we're operating as we were previously, no, that's not the case. No, I don't think we've been impacted by that at all. There's not a push for us to inspect more buildings or do this, that, or the other thing. For us, it's, we're managing the city's data. So that's what we hold ourselves accountable for. That's not to say that it's not the case with other city agencies. Yes. I think we got to wrap it up. Is Matt around?
Yeah, that was my
Okay. Okay. 2 more questions, and I'll release you all. Yes.
So I missed most of your talk. I apologize.
That's okay.
So what kind of feedback have you gotten from the OSM community?
It's been great. It really has been. I mean, a lot of it has been, sort of going over the data with a fine-tooth comb and asking, a lot of questions. But I think, it was very useful for them to understand the data, but for us to see how the data is used and, what it means to other people and some of the craziness and, that exists within the city. So to me, it's been a great experience. Yes.
How have they been using it? Like, have you been seeing, like, I don't know, in their feedback, are they like creating apps or are they?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure. Like, they're more involved in the actual maintenance of the data. I would imagine some of them on their, for their day jobs or maybe building apps around it. I don't have insight into that. And, hey, most of the people are doing it, at night. They're doing it on the weekend. They're doing it on their, free time. They're not doing it during work hours. So, I would hope they're using it as well. Why not?
And it being all open, did they need to give attribution to the city or anything like that?
Nope, it's licensed. It's unlicensed. It's out there, and when you release it, and that's the whole thing about OSM. OSM doesn't hold any licenses to it too. You know, it's out there. You can use it as your own. But you know, the only restriction is you can't then repackage it and sell it, right? So I guess one more question, and then we're all right. Well, thank you, everyone.